Following his entry into Jerusalem, Jesus spent the first part of the Passover week preaching to the crowds, healing the sick, and confronting the Jewish priests in the courtyard of the temple. His miracles and message angered the religious leaders so much they decided he must die. On Thursday morning, Jesus instructed his disciples to prepare a room in the city for a celebration of the Passover feast. That evening, during the meal, he offered his own prophecy of impending death and resurrection.
During the Passover Seder meal, he took the bread and he broke it, and he prayed. Most people don't know what he prayed. And he prayed a Hebrew prayer that is being prayed until today. And he said, "Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth." And when he said, "I am the bread of life," and he said, "Take, eat." So he was prophesying to the disciples that he will be put to death and he will be in the grave, and God the Father will raise him up. "Blessed are you, O Lord our God, who brings forth bread from the earth," meaning his body will be in the earth and it will be resurrected.
As the disciples shared in the rich symbolism of the Passover meal, only Jesus was aware that one of them planned to betray him.
After this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and testified, "I tell you the truth, one of you is going to betray me, the one to whom I will give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish." And he gave it to Judas Iscariot.
Judas's betrayal was no surprise to Jesus, for it had been predicted by the prophet David 1,000 years before Christ broke bread with his disciples in the upper room.
"My close friend, he who shared my bread, has lifted up his heel against me."
The specific details in that passage remind us that he's not just going to be betrayed by anybody, but by a friend, and then a friend with whom he breaks bread. You can't miss the fact that this is Judas at the Last Supper. It is so obvious that the prophecy literally shouts to us about its fulfillment in the New Testament.
The prophetic vision of Jesus' betrayal did not end with David's words in the 41st Psalm. In 500 BC, Zechariah also foretold another crucial detail.
"I told them, 'If you think it best, give me my pay.' So they paid me 30 pieces of silver."
The fulfillment of Zechariah's prophecy occurred more than 5 centuries later and is recorded in Matthew's Gospel.
Then Judas Iscariot went to the chief priests and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I betray him to you?" So they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver.
The common slave price in the Old Testament was 20 pieces of silver. You may recall that Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery for 20 pieces of silver. With inflation over time, by the time of the New Testament, it was 30 pieces of silver. Jesus was betrayed for the price of nothing more than a common slave. For Zechariah in the Old Testament era to predict that it would be 30 pieces of silver, not 20, was contrary to the economics of the day, and yet it had a prediction involved in it that it would be exactly that amount of money. Each detail tells us specifically what is going to happen so that when it occurs, it is obvious this is the fulfillment of it.
Following the Passover meal, Jesus led his disciples outside the city walls to the Mount of Olives and a garden called Gethsemane. It was a place they had often gathered during the 3 years of Christ's public ministry.
I've been in that garden many times. It's one of the most beautiful spots on earth. You stand there among the olive trees that are still there all these centuries later, and you're looking right back into Jerusalem. As they are there that evening, Jesus leaves some of the disciples in one place. He takes the three from the inner circle, Peter, James, and John. They go further into a deeper recess of the garden. It is there that Jesus throws himself on the ground, that he calls out to the Father and prays.
My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will.
As Christ agonized in prayer, he asked God for the strength to face the ordeal he knew was about to unfold, an ordeal described by the prophets centuries earlier.
We must understand that the decision to go to the cross of Calvary was first made under the olive trees at Gethsemane. And we know Jesus was under pressure because, being God, he had foreknowledge. He knew what was ahead. He knew that he was going to be betrayed by Judas Iscariot. He knew that he was going to bear the sin of the world. He knew that he was going to be crucified, that his back would be torn open. But I think the thing that he recoiled from the most was the knowledge that he who was holy and pure and sinless was going to take upon himself all that was unholy and impure and sinful. So indeed, it was the passion.
In the gathering darkness, Judas led the temple guard into Gethsemane and identified Jesus with a kiss. Christ's betrayal was complete, and prophecy again fulfilled.
It had to happen. It had to happen. Someone had to give him away. He went with all the power in the world that he could control every single event. He went without resistance.
As Christ was taken away by the temple guard, Peter leaped to the aid of his master, cutting off the ear of Malchus, the servant of the high priest. Jesus immediately healed the wounded man and rebuked his disciple.
Put your sword back in its place, Jesus said. Do you think I cannot call on my Father and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen in this way?
Jesus dares to say that all the prophecies, the pictures, the illustrations in the Old Testament all point to me. He goes to the cross knowing what it is all about. He faces the prediction of these prophecies, knowing their fulfillment is not only that of the blessing of the kingdom yet to come, but of the suffering of the servant who must die in our place.